Ladies and gentlemen, we're just about to start this afternoon's presentation. We thank you very much for joining us. We have some special guests here, and I'm going to let Migrant Heritage Project Chairperson Franca Facci do the introductions. Please welcome her here this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome everybody to a really quite special occasion around the discussion around how Wollongong actually transformed Australia. Before I start, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting, which is the Dharawal peoples of the Yuin Nation. I think it's particularly important on occasions where we are talking about migration history to really recognise that the dispossession of Aboriginal people was at the expense of migrants who actually benefited from coming to Australia. I'm really enthused about today's event because I've been able to catch up with people who I consider who were colleagues and people who worked at the university when I was working in migrant health at the time many years ago, and now great to be able to call, I guess, my friends in many ways. We did try to get a gender balance, but unfortunately we couldn't get any other women here, so sorry boys. But today's session really complements the work that's exhibited on the walls of the Facci room and some of the objects that are in here as well. Because as you know, the exhibition that's been run in conjunction with the University of Wollongong Library and Archives and a collaboration with the Migration Heritage Project of the Illawarra, and the MHP is an organisation that's been around for about 15 years, promoting and researching the history of migration to the Illawarra and the benefits and stories that come from that migration. And one of the things that I guess we are really very passionate about is that there's been great value to our culture and our society from migration to this country, and it has transformed not only Wollongong but many other parts of the country. In fact, I don't know that any of us could imagine Australia without the cuisine, without the values of hard work that have come from a lot of the communities that have settled in Australia, and in fact I think the harmony that's come from a diverse community. So I'd really like to begin by introducing Andrew Jakubowicz, who is a Professor of Sociology at the University of Technology, Sydney. He's an honours degree from the University of Sydney and a PhD from the University of New South Wales. And he's been involved since the early 70s in action research and race relations, and been centrally involved in the development of materialist theories of cultural diversity. He's taught at many universities, both in Australia and overseas, United States, Europe and Asia, founding director of the Centre for Multicultural Studies here at the University of Wollongong, a very seminal organisation. He's published widely and led the research team that produced Racism, Ethnicity and the Media, more recently been involved in multimedia documentaries such as Making Multicultural Australia and The Menorah of Phang Bang Lu. He was historical advisor to the exhibitions on the Jewish communities of Shanghai at the Sydney Jewish Museum, at the National Maritime Museum and the National Travelling Exhibition Crossroads, Shanghai and the Jews of China. He was foundation chair of the Disability Studies and Research Institute. Please welcome Professor Andrew Jakubowicz.
Thanks, Franca. It's amazing when they go back into your ancient past to discover and you remember things you've forgotten you've done. Well, thank you all very much for coming today, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of the traditional owners of the land on whom we meet. It's an interesting moment here. I was walking up North Films Avenue, getting off the bus, and thinking of the first day, the first time I'd ever arrived in Wollongong. Right? This is a long time ago. It was in the early 70s when I was a PhD student at New South Wales Uni. And somehow or other I found this former drug squad sergeant who was running a caravan park somewhere in Kiama, and I was doing some research on the drug scene, as one does, as one does at that time. And we met up in the Harp Hotel in Coronel Street, that some of you may know. Some of you may know too well. And I went in to meet him, and he got up, and then he walked us into the corner, and he sat down with his back into the corner looking at the door. And I, of course, just had my back to the door. And he said, one thing you need to know about Wollongong is always sit with your back to the wall. And I thought that was a sort of a good moment to get a sense of the sort of frisson that the city carried. Come 1979, I arrived back from the UK, and I moved into sociology here as a Centre lecturer. And my job was, as Franca said, to look after trying to get the Centre for Multicultural Studies sort of moving from the state of which it was into something bigger, and something which turned into very much bigger when Stephen Castles came into the scene some years later and moved it forward. But at the time, the day after I arrived, I picked up the Illawarra Mercury to see what sort of town I moved into. And again, some of you may remember this and others may not. There was a guy by the name of Chico Reeves. Anyone remember Chico Reeves? Yeah, someone knows that.
The late Chico Reeves.
The late Chico Reeves. He was very late. He was actually just the late Chico Reeves. The day before. Chico Reeves was one of the sort of drug dealers and standover men, pimps and general roustabouts that operated in the waterside unions at the time. And he was found in his, I think it was in his white Valiant, I think it was something like that, parked on the coal loader road in Port Kembla, and somebody had put a shotgun through it. I thought, okay, well, into Wollongong. Because it seems to sort of capture again that things were, it was a tough town, but it was a town in which people had few illusions. They knew what they were here for, which was to make a life for themselves. And if they didn't look after themselves and each other, nobody else was going to do it for them. And I think that sort of set the terms of a lot of what I want to talk about today. When I was asked to come up with the topic, I thought, well, probably talk about the period that I know best and think about it. And it actually forced me to think about what actually had happened over those years in Wollongong from the late 70s to the late 80s, because they really were a massively important period for the town. From the post-war period, probably up till the late 70s, Wollongong was defined by the steelworks. Right? After the late 80s, it would never be defined by the steelworks again. So there was a period of sort of significant transition that took place there. So I arrived, I was here for 8-9 years, and I was trying to think of all the things that happened during that period. When I arrived in Australia, back in Australia, there was this guy in Melbourne called Franca who just produced a report about post-migration settlement and services. And the then Prime Minister, you may remember, this is the guy who's having a bit of a problem with that guy from Queensland at the moment, Malcolm Fraser. Malcolm Fraser decided that he would table the Galbally report in federal parliament in 10 languages. Well, that's interesting. And then I checked to see if any other government had ever tabled anything in any language other than English from that period. And as far as I could tell, the answer was no. Okay. So, that was actually a crucial, symbolic and practical moment. The government of the day accepted the whole idea of multiculturalism. Most Australians didn't have a clue about what they were talking about. Most Australians still don't have a clue about what they were talking about, but particularly the current government. But at that moment, it was like a gear had been really seriously shifted. It was like somebody said, okay, white Australia is over. We've done that. Didn't work all that well. Got to do something different. And it was at that period, just before I arrived back, that the Australian government made two really important decisions, which obviously are worrying Mr Dutton still today. The first of those was to take the escapees, as it were, from the Indochina Wars and help them find new lives in Australia. That was such a critical decision. because Australia hadn't had since the late 1890s a growing Asian community. Chinese community in Australia had been shrinking through that whole period under the White Australia, and we'd never before made a decision that we were going to change the racial mix of Australian society quite that way. Because if you looked at the migrants who were around, if you like, in the late 1970s in Wollongong, almost none of them were what you call Asian. They were from all parts of Europe and from South America and some from North Africa and so on, from parts of the Middle East. But it wasn't an Asian thing. And again, I remember early on in my time here that there was a gentleman, some of you may remember, called Ross May. Right? Remember Ross May? This is starting to push. Okay. Ross May was otherwise known as the Skull, right? And he represented the leading edge of what today would be called alt-right. He was a guy who represented the Australian Nazi Party, and he was reviled by other right-wing nationalists because Nazism was, of course, a foreign ideology that had no place in Australia. If you're going to be an Australian nationalist, you have to be an Australian and not kowtow to these German idiots. Okay, so May used to wander up and down at the Migrant hostel down at Ferry Meadow, carrying signs saying, you know, slopes go home, and various things like that. And the city sort of didn't really like him. And they were gradually coming together, recognising that the changes that were taking place were something they would need to come to terms with. It was a big issue for the unions, for instance. The left unions, and the FIA, surprisingly down here, had a slightly left of secular leadership compared with the rest of the country. And the more skilled trade unions tend to be at the left. And they had a very hostile reaction initially to the arrival of the Vietnamese community, because the Vietnamese were seen as being collaborators with the South Vietnamese regime, enemies of the popular uprising, and everyone had cheered on the National Liberation Front and its victory in Vietnam. So these were the enemy. It took a little while for them to discover that the enemy were actually just people who wanted to find somewhere to find a job, get on with their lives, and soon turned out to be extremely good trade union members because they understood what organisation could deliver for them, and they knew what isolation meant for them. So you had that group, and that started to change things quite quickly at one level. The second group that we've not really had before, though there'd been, in the late 60s, early 70s, there'd been a Turkish inflow to Wollongong, quite a significant Turkish community. We really hadn't had significant numbers of Muslim Arabs before. Turks could pass even the immigration department's test of being almost European, or the light-skinned ones. Somehow we just had a hard time because the light-skinned ones were let in and the dark-skinned ones were told they were too dark. But once we got rid of that in 1973, the Turkish community grew quite a lot. But the Lebanese community in particular was something that was unknown. We had a Lebanese Christian community down here, quite a significant one, but we didn't quite know what to do with the Muslims. So from the mid-70s, late 70s on, the Illawarra, like other parts of Australia, particularly other parts of Sydney, started to experience a lot of cultural changes. So we've got the change in political ideology, political philosophy around multiculturalism. Rather than forcing people to become like us, rather than forcing people to become like us, we were more interested in what they could contribute while sharing in, if you like, the writing of the future script of Australian society. So rather than giving them their lines, which were always going to be, you know, bit parts on the edge, which they had to learn off by heart and come out with, we're going to let them sit at the table and try and draft the script with it. Right? So a big change in the way we're thinking. And soon after I arrived, all the institutions of multicultural society started to work, started to come into existence, might be a better way of putting it, took a while for them to work. Channel O started to broadcast. The Special Broadcasting Service came into existence. In 1980, Channel O launched in Wollongong. I can remember the night storm. When it came on air, I was thinking that's really quite extraordinary. What are these people doing? The first Microsil Centres were established in Wollongong. I want to talk about that in a moment. There was an Australian Institute for Multicultural Affairs, which was engaging in research about cultural diversity in the country and dealing with it seriously as a social question that needed to be developed and planned and introduced into policy. That even the New South Wales government is starting to get its act together under NIFTY. So we found, for instance, that just about this time, 40 years ago, the Ethnic Affairs Commission was established. They published a report in 76, 77 on called Participation, which was all about how migrant communities better participate in the political, economic and social life of the state. Really dramatically changed concepts from even 10 years before. Then they followed this with the Anti-Discrimination Board, which was really crucial, in fact, to what was going to happen in Wollongong, the ADB. Okay. So, in a short time, we actually moved from, if you like, the tail end of white Australia into something altogether very, very different. And so, besides the Maltese, the Macedonians, the Greeks, the Italians, the Serbo-Croatians, the Spanish, Polish, the Dutch, the Germans, and all the other groups, Chilenos and so on, that had made up what we understood as migrant Wollongong, we're starting to see these new people coming in, various sorts of Asian groups. I want to talk towards the end of my speech a bit about what it looks like today. Okay. So in that context of massive ideological and philosophical change, institutional change, political change, and economic change, all sorts of things started there. And I want to talk about three cases, I think, which I think are give you valuable insights into what Wollongong was about and why Wollongong is so important in the national identity, the changes in the national identity and national process. And probably should be four, because without redback graphics, like, nothing would happen. Somehow or other, those guys, they just captured the zeitgeist at the moment and made everyone feel really better about what they were doing. It's very, very important. Right. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is a bit about the steel industry. As we know, in that period in the early 1980s, particularly leading up to 83, 84, the steel industry was in serious crisis. The coal industry was in crisis, the steel industry was in crisis. But something else had also happened a bit before that. The big thing that really started to happen first, before the steel industry started to tank, was the clothing and footwear industry. It tanked in the 70s, well and truly. And the thing about it, I was doing a bit of research about this, looking at the project around us on the walls and reading some of that material. When the steelworks was developing, the state government put a lot of energy into recruiting clothing and footwear, clothing and textile factories into the Illawarra to provide work for the wives of the male workers at the steelworks. That was the model. Right? And so there were vast numbers of these factories where migrant women worked. There are lots of pictures of them doing those sorts of things. I know Franca's mum was in fact one of those. So with the tanking, if you like, of the clothing industry, the opportunities for women to work and their economic role was very difficult. And most of the women who lost their jobs soon ended up working as outworkers. Both new women coming in, a lot of the women who lost their jobs got work as outworkers. I want to talk about that in a moment. But first of all, amongst all these the women who were losing their jobs were lots of women who thought this sucked. And there were all these jobs going to steelworks, which was at that stage still fine. And whenever they went there to try and get jobs, they were told there were no jobs for women. Or actually there were, if you wanted to be a sweeper, but there was a list like a mile long of people applying to be sweepers. And a number of them, particularly those who had industrial experience in Europe, and I remember a number of the Macedonian women, particularly in this regard, were particularly pleased. They came out of a society which, whatever one would say about Yugoslavia, actually put into practice notions of gender equality. It had to, the economy had to work that way, and nobody would have thought of saying, oh, women shouldn't work in industry. So they came with certain expectations. They discovered that they'd entered something that looked like the Middle Ages, or the post-Middle Ages, wherever it might be. Some sort of Victorian moment, where women had their legs wrapped like pianos, right? And they decided that they wanted to do something about it. And leaving aside some of the detail of the politics, which was particularly painful then, and I don't want to try and reminisce too much about it, a project emerged, or a campaign emerged, called the Job Swimmer campaign. Now, this was actually a critical campaign on a whole series of reasons. It ran for about 13 years, which makes it one of the longest industrial campaigns in Australian history. It was run by women, and it went through a number of cycles. The first cycle of which was BHP resisting giving jobs to women, and then the women winning on 2 points. Firstly, they had the ADB, they went to the ADB and said, look, we can carry heavier weights than they say that we're allowed to carry, right? We want you to do something about that. So it's a whole issue about saying, look, if a woman actually weighs, 100 kilos and, and can bench press 80, making her carry 20 kilos around the floor is actually not actually a good idea. And so a number of these women were able finally to get jobs. And over a period of time, significant hundreds of migrant women got employment. And I remember one of them, who I interviewed some years later, saying, the day I got my crane driver certificate was like heaven, right? Because then I could sit up there in the crane near the open heart, and I could drive this thing at full speed down the middle of the steelworks with a couple of tons of molten steel swinging underneath me, and I felt like a queen. So there was that sort of transformation. And then, of course, the crisis of the steel industry happened. Women were the last on, first off. And then for the next, I think, 6 or 8 years, they fought for compensation for the failure of BHP to employ them when they first. And they won. Many hundreds of them won, and they were paid compensation, etc. Not much, and BHP appealed and all the rest of it. But it was actually a crucial transformation because, firstly, the anti-discrimination board was allowed by Neville Rand to take this on as a case, very expensive exercise, they took it on, and it was their first big women's work case, and it was won, effectively. So that changed many things in the Australian environment. Not everybody realises how much it changed things, but the flow-on from that struggle was very, very important. What time do you want to finish?
Keep going.
Okay, good. Okay, the second case. Let's do its thing. The second case relates to this. It's the other line. Right? We've got one line that goes to taking on the steelworks and becoming industrial workers in the steel environment. The other was this whole question of outwork. At the time, as the outwork was spreading, as the clothing and textile industry tanked, the attitude of both the regulators, Department of Industry, and the unions was that outwork was an illegal activity carried out by nefarious, self-employed, small entrepreneurs who were undercutting what was happening in the factory world and causing the demise of the industry. And if you ever found one, you would hound them to the ends of hell and report them to everybody, and they'd have take a court and the rest of it. So life for outworkers who were earning almost nothing was fairly desperate. And at the time, there was a rising spread of RSI, repetition injury, which was quite widespread in a number of industries which employed women, including factories and including amongst outworkers. And the problem for outworkers was because they weren't employees, they would have no recourse. So an outworker who got RSI was really stuck. Couldn't work, couldn't get insurance, couldn't get anything. And in Wollongong, one of the agencies here decided to see what they could do about that. They set up an outworker project with some help from the Law Foundation in Sydney, and they started to work out how you might go about changing. Well, step one was, how do you actually get women who are outworkers who get injured, how do you get them covered in some way or other? So the first thing they had to do was prove that on objective criteria, these women were employees. Right? This was a really difficult job, because what they had to do was track the way in which the clothing and textile industry worked and demonstrate that somewhere above the line of the outworker, someone was making the decisions which would normally be made by employers or managers. Right? That is, they were not free self-employed workers setting their own conditions and their own rates. They were not freely negotiating. And a Chileno woman, who was part of the Chilean movement here, became involved in that. She had RSI, and the help of this agency, they did a lot of research onto who was the putter out, who was the middleman, or who did he do it for? Who did he do it for? Who were the companies that they actually supplied? So they got a picture of the whole supply chain, from this outworker being screwed at home on this sort of slightly out-of-date machine in the garage, all the way through to, as it turned out, one of the chairs of one of our funding bodies who bought his shirts at a very expensive store in Sydney that happened to get made in the Illawarra. It was a very interesting conversation, saying, excuse me, you know where you got your shirt, etc. Okay, so it went to the appropriate tribunal, and the tribunal found that in fact she was an employee. Now, once she was an employee, the tribunal then named the middleman as the employer of Illawarra. So he became responsible for her conditions of work. And once that happened, it was also the case that the clothing union had appointed a new organiser who wasn't one of the old Irish guys, but in fact a young Australian woman, Anna Ford. Some people may remember her. She became quite an active political figure. And she said, okay, I get where you're coming from. Why don't we try and recruit these women? Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to recruit them, demonstrate that they're employees, register them, right? Make sure that their places of work are registered. Right? Now, it's going to cost them a bit to do this, but they will gain in terms of occupational health and safety coverage, right? And they'll gain in terms of being able to negotiate a better piece rate. And over a period of time, that's more or less what happened. Right? Now, it's come backwards and forwards, it constantly changes, depending on what's happening in the industry and what the political memory is of the people involved. But at that time, what that meant was that suddenly this whole group of women who'd been marginalised and put to one side had their status completely transformed. And not just in Wollongong, of course, but across New South Wales. And not just across New South Wales, but this happened, it fed on into what's happening in Victoria and other parts of the country. Right? So, second point, how Wollongong changes through. Now the third point, which is a bit closer to home and much more self-obsessed. 5 cookies. One of the recommendations of the Galway report was the creation of what we call Microsil Centres. And it's wonderful. One of these, there's one of the group that's Mike's designs for the annual general meeting party for the Microsil Centre in Wilson Street. When the Resource Centre was being set up initially, the government was of the view, as they say. Michael McKellar was the immigration minister, so it's still in a moment of clarity before madness totally overtook. He was of the view that it would be really nice if these migrant resource centres, which have been recommended by Galway, would be set up in heavily market areas, and they would have a committee to run them, right? A local committee. So there would be someone from the local government, someone from the state government, someone from the Commonwealth, and then there would be people from the community who the department would identify and select. People who were putting together the Microsil Centre at the time thought this sounds slightly difficult, because remember the report from the State Department, the Ethnic Affairs Commission, was called Participation. So they went on the rampage basically, recruiting people as members of this organisation. Nobody had said they couldn't have a membership. They said that their committee had to be appointed by the minister. So, and members are good, because members it shows that it's got validity and there are people involved. But the members, as they joined up, and there were Macedonians, there were Yugoslavs, they were known then, there were Italians, there were Greeks, all sorts of people. And they had a slightly different view of the way in which all this should work, which is they should elect from the people who they respected to be part of this committee. And this went on, and the department passed it off, and the department passed it off, and the department passed of was 1 hour to midnight before the AGM. The minister was in Darwin, being bombarded with, I think at the time, telegrams. We used telegrams before. Okay. And being told that, you know, if there was no elected committee, there'd be no Microsil Centre. Whoops. So 1 hour before midnight, he said, yes, let's have an elected committee. What a good idea. I thought of that, of course I did, yes. Thank you everyone for agreeing to participate in this democratic process and how wonderful it is for the people, these new citizens of Australia, to be so actively committed to our democratic principles. And so the Microsil Centre in the Illawarra had an elected committee, and then so did the ones in Sydney, and the ones in Melbourne, the ones in Brisbane, the ones in South Australia, etc., etc. And to this day, as far as I know, the Microsil Centres and their descendants, of which there are many, all have elected committees. And they tend to be places where migrant community people learn how to be decision makers, managers, planners, work with people from different ethnic groups, collaborate, get out of their own little ghettos, but think about what it means to live in a multicultural Australia. So, 3 ways in which Wollongong in the 1980s changed Australia. And I think probably changed it for the better, I think. Because I think most of the outcomes that we're looking at were actually quite important ones that carry now nearly 2 generations later all sorts of benefit to people who may never have heard of these stories, never even imagined that such a thing might have happened. It was, as I said, a very difficult time. When the Jobs for Women campaign was running, there were about 23,000 people working at steelworks. By the time that women were compensated, there were 7,000. We were talking before this, you know. At the time it started, the university was this small pimple amidst the trees and the lakes, as the Macedonians came down on Sunday mornings to shoot the ducks in the pond. Now it's this magic sort of metropolis of its own, one of the major employers, major economic drivers of the region. So I think, in summary, I'd say this: Wollongong was a place that was big enough to have an impact on what's going to happen across Australia, but it was small enough a place for people to act together and to change outcomes and to actually do something within a sort of cohesive community. And it was also a moment when, as the industrial crisis, in a sense, upended the order of things, the old Australia really started to go down the slipway, that many new initiatives emerged and many new ideas found their feet and found a way of building resilience right across Australia. And that's how Wollongong changed the nation.
Thank you, Andrew. You have refreshed so many of my memories of those days as I was a fledgling migrant health worker in Cringilla, along with Glenn Mitchell, who I'll introduce to you in a moment. Yes, was one of the workers and community advocates who actually got people involved in Microsil Centres and worked with one of the women from the Jobs for Women campaign, who's only recently retired from the health service. So there's lots of linkages and very significant stories that I think form the story of Wollongong itself. Now, I know we're going to have a panel discussion in a few minutes, but before I do that, I'd like to introduce Professor Stephen Castles, who was also at the University of Wollongong many years ago as the head of the Centre for Multicultural Studies, but up until recently was also the research chair at the University of Sociology at the University of Sydney. He's a sociologist and political economist. He's worked on international migration dynamics, global governance, multiculturalism, transnationalism, migration and development, and regional migration trends in Africa, Asia and Europe. His research and publications have made an influential contribution to the development of interdisciplinary migration research for many years. And he's an honorary associate and former director of the International Migration Institute. And then Dr. Glenn Mitchell, who many of you are familiar with because he's still here at the University of Wollongong, is an award-winning senior lecturer in the history program in the School of Humanities and Social Inquiry at the University of Wollongong. After completing his PhD, Glenn was Director of Migrant Health and my former boss for the New South Wales Department of Health, which in turn led to opportunities to write ethnic access policies for the New South Wales Department of Local Government and the National Migrant Health Policy for the Office of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Glenn's also a passionate supporter of the Liverpool football team and highly enthusiastic about learning to play jazz drums as well. Little bits of Glenn's background that we didn't know about before. But I'd like to open up the panel for discussion, but I'd just like to ask both Stephen and Glenn to just provide commentary on Andrew's presentation, and then you guys think of all your questions. I'm sure there's millions of them, to be able to do that. I have to take the microphone to both Glenn and Stephen, if that's okay.
That was a terrifically interesting paper and told me a lot of things, or talk, and told me a lot of things I didn't know. And it was really interesting to see these ways in which, especially labour issues that have been pioneered here in the Illawarra, affected New South Wales and Australia, and possibly beyond Australia, I would venture to say. And I just, because I tend to work on global issues, it would be interesting for me to reflect on the opposite, how the world has changed the Illawarra. And I'm afraid it's not nearly such a positive picture. And when I hear the things that Andrew was talking about, I think, God, those things were possible in the 70s and 80s, and they're unthinkable now. Compare our Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, Mr. Dutton, with the ministers, even in the Fraser government, Ian McPhee and people like that. I saw Ian McPhee just last week at a conference on refugees, and he asked a very good question. And he's still obviously very interested in this area, whereas, Mr. Dutton, when he talks about refugees, and particularly asylum seekers who come by boat, he seems to foam at the mouth almost, because he gets so upset and so angry about it. So, I mean, what has changed? Why have things that seemed possible back then, why do they seem so impossible now? We're clearly, perhaps one could say we were very much on an upward trend in diversity and multiculturalism and recognition and acceptance of that in that period, right through to the 90s, I think. And now we're on a downward curve. And I think it's very disturbing. In the early 90s, I used to go to conferences in Europe and say, please learn from the Australian model. It's so good. Now Mr. Abbott does that, but he means something totally different. So I think what we're witnessing at the moment, and it's very disturbing, and it's really come to a head this year, first with Brexit, and then with the election of Donald Trump, and all the doomsday predictions about the European elections of next year. Why has the world become so hostile to refugees in particular, to diversity in general? What has really changed? And I think, I don't know, maybe it's going too far to say that that's part of the crisis of neoliberalism, because in the upswing of neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s, it was always a system of economic control, an extension of economic control to the rest of the world, but it was also a period of social and cultural liberalism, openness to new ideas about how we should live together, and about the value of different cultures. And now, really, we seem to be entering a phase of nationalism, of moving away from all that, and moving very much backwards on social and cultural questions. And it's partly because of the stagnation of the global economic system. Since the recession that started in 2008, there hasn't been a real recovery. There's been a recovery at the top end of town, bigger and bigger profits and bonuses and invested, with more and more investor value, but the situation of ordinary working people has either stagnated or declined, in fact. And I mean, that's what led to Trump's victory, presumably, in the United States. So I think what we need to consider is how to safeguard some of those advances in a dismal period, some of the advances that Andrew was talking about. I mean, you know, the world moves in waves and things will change for the better again, but it won't happen for a while. So we really need to think, you know, how do we protect what has been achieved? So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And the second one is, I haven't been at this university for 16 years, and it's amazing how it's changed, and clearly how the region, the Illawarra region, has changed with it. And I mean, obviously these two things are interdependent, but the city seems to be, or the area seems to be very different from what it was back in the 90s when I was here. So yeah, I need to learn more about what's happening with me.
All right, so when Andrew had his meeting at the Harp Hotel, back in the day, it was a little more dangerous than he actually realised, because that strip of road not only did it see the death of Chickaroos, but on the 17th green at the Wollongong Golf Club, a Greek migrant, Charlie Lilios, had been bashed to death, and that's still an open case. We've not found his murderer. And across the road from the Harp Hotel was the Oxford Hotel, where in 1951 Lucy Frances Barrows was murdered by 3 Hungarian migrants. And as shocking as this crime was, the judge, when he gave a sentence, and he sentenced each of these men to death, they were subsequently commuted, was less interested in excoriating them for committing a violent crime and more interested in saying, you have let all migrants down by becoming murderers. So there's kind of there's this expectation that migrants were to do a good thing. They were here to do good work. These are the same group of people who went to the steelworks, and just quoting from an unpublished novel by Pietro Tedeschi, in his character Reggio Emilio, this left-wing fitter from Bologna, was working with the steelworks, and he said he was working in a steel jungle submerged in smoke, dust, fire and roars and bangs filling the air with the primitive methods used in clearing a flooded area was to dig a trench. And he says, he's this left-wing fitter and turner, and he says, how original. What about water pumps? I asked myself, Leonardo da Vinci had only invented them 400 or 500 years earlier. These are the same group of people who sent their children to Cringilla Public School, which was written up in at least 2 places. One, that esteemed journal, the Australian Women's Weekly, on what a success story Cringilla Public School was. But even better / worse was the story in BHP Review, where the author equated Cringilla Public School with the New Jerusalem and said that this was such a success story, and these words are ingrained on my memory, I cannot forget them even if I tried, where he talked about the success of the schools, and he said, here are bullet-headed Poles and blue-eyed Aryans. This is in the BHP Journal of the 1970s. So, and despite these appalling descriptions, these appalling working conditions, immigrants in the city seem to have triumphed over that and almost themselves. So if we look also at the Galbally report, what Andrew didn't mention was that the Galbally report recommended the provision of healthcare interpreters and ethnic health workers in all major areas in New South Wales and Australia where there were high concentrations of people from non-English speaking backgrounds. When I became Director of Migrant Health, Wollongong had not one ethnic health worker. We were the most immigrant area in the state. It took a red scheme, it took me knowing someone in the office of Prime Minister and Cabinet, to get a $500,000 grant to employ 13 ethnic health workers who subsequently go on to change. Franca is one of the beneficiaries because I poached her from Italian social welfare. And those 13 people began to change not only their lives, because I recruited them from the dole queue, many of them from the dole queue, but also changed the way in which health for a population from non-English speaking backgrounds is delivered in the Illawarra. Up until then, I think we've probably got a generation of Turkish boys who were sexually scarred for life because they were accompanying their mothers to gynecologists to do the interpreting, and I'm certain these boys, I can't imagine what horrors they went through in interpreting from mum to the gynecologist and backwards and forwards. And at the centre of this, as Andrew said, is the steelworks. So this is the business that set up its office in Belgrade next to the Australian Embassy to recruit Yugoslav workers to come to the steelworks. This is the same company who in the 1970s not only ends up eventually in the High Court over the Jobs for Women campaign. What Andrew didn't mention is this becomes a benchmark case. This is the only case in the High Court of Australia where BHP loses, and the crux of the loss is the immigrant women from the Jobs for Women campaign in Wollongong. Now this is also the company which, when it wanted to provide a coal wash dump in Cringilla for the benefits of residents, 640 coal truck journeys a day from 8 in the morning till 10 in the evening, including Good Friday, Easter Sunday and Christmas Day, 6 to 8 million tonnes of coal wash over a 5 to 7 year period, and then they would turn it into sporting fields, baseball fields, barbecue pits, as if Cringilla would become a barbecue suburb. And the threat was, if you don't accept this, we may have to close the steelworks. And when we did a submission against the recommendation and the urgings of the New South Wales Premier, we did a submission to a public inquiry which eventually saw BHP lose yet again 2 losses, one Jobs for Women, the other one Cringilla coal wash dump. Everyone around the proposed site who was interviewed by an interpreter on the basis of anonymity, who'd come from a non-English speaking background, could not hold back. Some may have needed medicating about their hatred and their anger at what the steelworks had done to them and their lives, because these people were all injured, many of them injured, damaged, or suffering health problems from pollution. So we've had a scenario here where power, class, big business have attempted to manipulate a group of people. Now, the group of people that they attempted to manipulate never got together and said, we're going to overcome this, but they did. And I think that the strength and the power of Wollongong, little old Wollongong, who no longer has its major business, the steelworks down the road. I'm proud to say it's the University of Wollongong. In the 1970s and 1980s, if you would have said this had become the biggest employer in town, you might have needed to be fast-tracked to Ward 20. That wasn't on the horizon. But this town, those people and their relatives and friends have all triumphed over something which I don't think originally the city and their employers would really wanted them to triumph over. And I think that is the driving story, the driving success story of what migration, heritage, Wollongong and the contemporary story really means.
Thank you. Does anyone want to ask a question in particular or make a comment? Oh, okay. I'm going to start. Can't help myself. I guess in the context of an exhibition around migration heritage, I'm keen to explore and understand what your views are with respect to the lessons of the past influencing the future, and particularly with respect to the current discourse around migration and asylum to Australia.
I think what we're seeing is a return to assimilationism. That you know, the idea of diversity, which was so strong from the 1970s onwards, is now being reinterpreted in security terms. Again, Minister Dutton's speech a couple of days ago, where he said Fraser made a big mistake letting in Muslims from Lebanon. I mean, it's just very emblematic of where thinking is going. And we're not seeing a great deal of resistance to that from the main opposition party at the moment, from the Labour Party. So I think that there is much more suspicion of diversity now. Obviously, it's a product of world events. You know, that there is now this discourse that Islam is fundamentally a danger to Western values and so on and so forth. And of course, by doing that, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we abandon those Western values of inclusion and force people into an isolationist situation. So anyway, I'll pass on.
I think there's a great old philosopher who said, history repeats itself. First is tragedy, then is farce. Unfortunately, farce can also be extremely painful, as we're discovering today, I think. I'm thinking about this notion that we're simply going back to an assimilationist perspective. I think that may well be the rhetoric of people like Dutton, but if you actually sort of do a micro test of what actually happened, say for instance at the last federal election, which I think was a very interesting one. As we know, the new government, or the Liberal government, won by zip seats, right? Okay. So there were 4 seats they should have lost. Okay. And they won those seats against the trend. And what fascinated me, though, when I drilled down to try and work out what was going on there, was why the vote went the way it did. I mean, just a little bit it went the way it just got them across the line. And these were 4 seats in which the Chinese community was a significant part of the population. Right? And remember, like, so Wollongong 1970s Chinese community exists only in terms of some very interesting transcultural Chinese restaurants. Today, as we know, the Chinese community is a very big part of Australian society. So when I looked at those electorates, what I discovered was that the vote that had actually changed dramatically was a doubling in the vote of the Christian Democrats, or the Family First, or Christian Democrats, one or the other, doesn't matter. That vote had gone in those seats quite dramatically, it doubled, and that the preferences of those voters had gone completely to the Liberal Party. And that's what had given them the seat. So how did that happen? Well, as it turned out, a number of journalists have identified it. So it turned out the Chinese community was mobilised around 2 particular issues. One was the issue of same-sex marriage, and the other was the issue of safe schools. And on WeChat, which is a Chinese sort of social media site, the campaign was launched by a couple of people, activists from the Evangelical Christian Church, Chinese kids, young men, who raised the fear of, can't you say the fear of Christ? Almost the fear of God, and drove them on these issues, which had nothing to do really with the election for anyone else in the country, towards this vote. Right? And that delivered Reed, it delivered banks, it delivered it delivered Chisholm, and it increased the vote in Bennelong for John Alexander, which you may remember that went to the Labour Party when John Howard was Prime Minister. Okay, so this to me suggests that one of the things we need to learn from the past is that ethnic communities think constantly in terms of 2 levels. They think in terms of their engagement with the wider Australian society, and they think in terms of engagement with the values that they value. And that these things combine and intersect in very, very different ways. When we're thinking about the sort of thing that Glenn talked about, Fringilla, and the mobilisation of the population around Fringilla, this was a huge layers of issues. And what was the most driving issue was what's going to happen to our children. Right? What is this going to, not to do to me, but how, my children are going to be destroyed by this. Right? We cannot have this happen. We cannot. So they're joining together with other parents as parents around this particular sort of threat. And I think that's a lot of the mobilisation was around those sorts of emotions and values which are trans group. Right? But there are also things happening inside each group. So groups were talking to each other. The Macedonians were talking to each other. The new Lebanese populations were talking to each other. The Croat, everybody was talking inside their own groups. And they were very, very fierce that they had to do something, and they had a right to do something about this. And I think the sort of work that Glenn did and the people he worked with there was really important, because it wasn't about just motivating people. It was, in a sense, licensing them to feel they could act in Australian society. Right? They were no longer marginalised strangers, but they were stakeholders in the future. Right? And I think maybe what we need to recognise is that by now, most migrant communities, in fact, I think all of them, feel as though they have a stake in the future. They may not like what people like that are doing. I was thinking, this guy's got to be mad. Does he know what's going to happen to those electorates? Right? The work the Liberal Party has been doing to try and win the Muslim vote in Western Sydney has been incredibly, it worked brilliantly over a period of time. The leading member of the Lebanese Muslim Association, president of the Lebanese Muslim Association, Samar Dundia, I think his name is, he's a card-carrying member of the Liberal Party. Right? And he's gone apoplectic. He also happens to be a multi-millionaire who made his money in the computer industry. And who are his primary clients in the computer industry? ASIO and the Federal Police. He is Australia's leading supplier of secure computing services to the Commonwealth security system. Right? And he is angry. So I think one of the things we're going to learn, I think Stephen's right to some extent, is that these people have memories, and they are so angry. Last time this sort of thing happened, which was the rubbish that Tony Abbott did on 18C, the reason he finally had to abandon 18C was because the head of ASIO and the head of the Federal Police together went on television and said, this is dangerous what is happening now, we have to stop this. Right? And that stopped it. Now both of those people have gone, and the people who have taken over from them don't have quite the same backbone because they were chosen by the new government. But the issue is still there. The politics of these things, I think, are much different to the way they were back in the 1950s, where migrants were told to stay quiet and not engage.
The other thing about learning from the past is that we might not have learned from it at all. So from 1850 to well after 1950, we had more than a century of institutionalised federal government sanctioned racism. Pre-Federation, it emerged through labour organisations. Post-Federation, it emerges as the 17th Act passed 2 days before Christmas because Parliament wanted to get home to have their Christmas dinner, which was the White Australia policy. And although it was abandoned and trashed by Whitlam, and good work was done post-Whitlam, Hanson's election, first time round, probably showed how thinly spread the goodness of multiculturalism was. That it could be wiped away so quickly by her, so that she became in effect the third political force in Australia, and the current Attorney General is expressing fear that she could become perhaps the second biggest political force in Queensland at the next state election, might tell us that those lessons of the past, which we should have learned, we ain't learned them properly.